Just letting it take a moment to start. Hi, everyone. We should be live on YouTube. Welcome to I think this is the fourth, or is it the fifth? The fifth episode of the Salem Center's discussion group discussing the election. And we're going to go for about an hour. We have one more person in the attendee list. I'm going to allow that person to talk. There we go. Gary, if you want to come live, you're welcome to. Let me know if you want to be part of this. Be visible on screen. I think your backdrop's up. Anyway, it's Carlos and me and Samil here. We are. This is the Salem Center, as I said, election discussion group, and this is our second to last time before the election. We've been meeting on Fridays. We're going to meet next Friday. The elections, of course, already started. Early voting in Texas is already happening. I don't know if any of you guys have voted. I'm planning on doing it early next week. But we have a few things to discuss today, and we'll meet again next week. And then maybe we'll have a follow-up after the election, especially to debrief on it, and especially if there's any news, if things don't go swimmingly or there's any kind of confusion about it to discuss. So we have a couple of topics to discuss today. One of them is the debate and people's takeaways from the debate. Another one actually kind of related to the topics that ended up getting the most attention at the debate is a Wall Street Journal article that Carlos referred us all to on Bidenomics, or I don't know how you say that, they play on Reaganomics, but on Biden's economic plans, and in particular, what will be the results of his tax policy. So why don't we start off with Carlos? Tell us why you called that article to our attention and what your thoughts on it, and I'll be interested to hear anyone else's reactions to it, and then we'll go to the debate.
So let me just say that I did vote this week. That was my first ever election actually in the U.S., so I'm pretty happy about that. I'm an American citizen for 2.5 years now, I think, or 3 years. So excited about that, and I'm glad to say that I voted for both Biden and Trump this cycle. So I got to vote for Biden in the primary, and I got to vote for Trump in the general. So, in some ways, I'm part of the process. Whatever happens in a couple weeks from now. And all right, so let's talk. And by the way, I voted here in Gregory Gym on campus, and it was wonderful. I'm glad. Very well organized and pretty empty actually. So this week things were actually very empty here. I think a lot of people, there were lines in the first week, and I'm guessing there'll be lines next week, which is the last week of early voting, right? But this week was actually very, very nice. So I'm glad that they did a good job with early voting. So about the article, let's talk about the article for a second. So the article was an attempt to evaluate by a number of professors that were involved here. The professors were professor from Fitzgerald from Texas Tech, Kevin Hassett from the Hoover Institution, Kalen from the University of Wisconsin Econ Department, which is a pretty leading top econ department in the country, and Casey Mulligan from the University of Chicago. Okay, so those are all economists with not only bona fide pedigree in terms of their economic abilities, but also they have been involved in government in one way or the other. So almost all of them were part of the CEA, which is the Council of Economic Advisors of the President, which typically, and it has been for the longest time, a group of economists that pretty much stay away from partisanship type things. It's basically about, okay, what it is this thing, what's our assessment about this, about that, about the other. But of course, there's always like a little bit of a taste that comes out of the committee, depending on who is the president, right? The president sort of like chooses economists. They're more in line with their views. And one of the things that actually takes place when you change those economists is some choices they have to make about scoring bills, thinking about the effect of bills. So some choices in the CBO oftentimes will have two types of choices. One that's a choice that the people on the right tends to like. One side of choice that the people on the left tends to like. So you gotta always take that into account a little bit. The assumptions matter. There's assumptions about downstream consequences that are always like best guesses, and there's a type of assumption that tends to be made by the right, that is, what are the sort of like incentives, consequences associated with this law, and that's something that the left tends to be more like not thinking about long run effect as much. But that said, using methodology very much similar to what CBO would do on scoring a bill, they wrote a report, and that report focused on 3 aspects of Biden's economic plan, not only tax, but economic plan and regulatory agenda more broadly. The first part of it had to do with the outcomes associated with the carbon tax, or the sort of like ways in which they're going to deal with carbon. That Biden's been speaking about, talking about carbon. And the sort of inferences made by these economists is that the intervention in the energy markets associated with these plans are going to lead to a big reduction, up to 2% reduction in what's called total factor productivity nationally, which is basically we're going to be doing less with the same amount of capital and labor invested, right? Because of the additional costs associated with energy. So that's one. So there'll be a big cost to the economy, to the measures associated with the carbon measures that he's putting forward. Second, the proposed changes in the regulatory framework around the ACA and how that impacts the labor market. So one of the biggest, so Casey Mulligan has written a lot about this, is that the way in which the Affordable Care Act was written has a lot of impacts on the labor market and created what we call wedges. Wedges, basically this sort of like kinks that stops people from working more in some situations and creating incentives for firms not to grow in other situations and so on. And the proposals that Biden has put in place to enhance the ACA has a potential large impact also here on basically employment. And the third aspect of it is the reversal of the 2017 tax cuts, in particular, the increased taxation on corporations and household incomes, which all put together, they estimate that we're looking at a 10-year period, that's a 10-year window that they're making this inference here, of about 3% reduction in total employment, 15% reduction in capital formation per person. So the total amount of installed capital in the country will reduce by 50% per person, and a real GDP drop of about 8% in 10 years. Okay, and that would translate to real consumption per household reduced by about 7% during that time. And that is not reduced from what today, reduced from what CBO tells us under current law will be in 10 years. So CBO puts forward, projections 10 years, where we're going to be in 10 years. And then you measure the sort of what the difference is based on these changes in law, right? So those are big changes. For just to put in perspective what that number, 8% is what we're looking at here, a potential change in potential GDP 10 years down the line. 10% is the number that the UN tells us that is under the worst case scenario for climate change, okay? The UN estimates, that's with a bunch of Nobel laureates in economics that were involved in that estimate, is that our potential GDP in 100 years is 10% lower. So the UN puts forward a prediction of, okay, how is climate change going to affect our economy in 100 years? Because the thing is a long run problem, right? Climate change. And then if we do nothing, their estimates that we're going to lose 10% of potential GDP in 100 years. And here we're talking in 10 years, by the actions proposed under the current plans of Biden, at the reduction of 8% in potential GDP in 10 years alone. So that's to put into context the sort of like levels that we're talking about here. So it's pretty strong. And again, one might criticize the fact that this might come from a partisanship point of view. I would have to look more carefully in the report to be able to evaluate maybe some of the projections and so on. But the magnitude of it is the part that scared me a lot when I read it. And I not only read the Wall Street Journal article, I went in and read the report a little bit. And yeah, so, that's the sort of like the number one reason why I said in our first meeting a couple of weeks ago, why I am comfortable voting for somebody that I don't have high regards personally and don't like a lot of his policies also. But the main reason why I'm comfortable casting that vote is for this reason. These are some numbers that back that up. You got muted, Greg.
Any thoughts or responses to that on anyone else's part, either agreeing, disagreeing with the ultimate implications of it?
So, yeah, I'd like to kind of ask a quick clarifying question. So did the CBO actually conduct this projection, or was it?
No, this is not. This is not. It's done by those professors. Yes.
Okay.
They are using methodologies similar to CBO.
Okay. And do you know the details of that methodology?
Well, there is a big black. There's a lot of different things that go into it, right? So I guess that's why it's important to point out that they're looking at CBO projections. They're doing something that is similar to what CBO and the CEA actually would do, right? And that's why I said at the beginning, there's a set of assumptions that I guarantee you that under a slightly different set of assumptions, those numbers will change, right? There's no question about that, and we can argue about those assumptions. And I would also probably agree that they're probably picking the set of assumptions. They're more in the direction of making this cost larger, right, than it actually is, potentially. But I think that if you think about the direction, right, if you think about the main things here, and it's really hard for any economist to say that you won't create harm. So we might argue the magnitude. But if you come up and raise taxes on energy, which essentially is the ideas associated with interference in the carbon market, is going to raise taxes on energy. Energy goes everywhere in terms of our production, right? So if you raise taxes there, it's akin to a tariff or to a corporate, so to a taxation of all companies at once. And that will reduce production. There's no way around that. We're going to suffer economically immediately for that. And it might be justified from the point of view of climate change, for example, right? So let's not pretend that it's not the reason. That plan is not an economic plan. It's a plan to mitigate climate change, okay? The other one also is not an economic plan. The ACA is something about providing people, expanding access to healthcare for people, right? And once again, there's a cost associated with that. And the main cost associated with that we have identified, we actually seen data on this very clearly in the past 10 years, is its impact on the job market. So employment growth, it would have been larger if it wasn't for the ACA. But once again, potentially justifiable from the perspective of, but at the same time, you're getting something as a result, right? Yeah. They're focusing on the economic consequence. So it's hard to see the ACA being something that's going to make us grow more. It's hard to see a carbon tax seen as something that's going to make us grow more. The third one, the reversal essentially of the 2017 corporate tax cuts and the increase of the marginal tax rates for higher earners. It's again something that's hard to see how that's gonna generate growth. That's not something that is a pro-growth policy. Something that you might argue that won't cause that much of a problem. And I think that's what we're seeing here, right? Those proposals that all go in the direction of potentially reducing growth, and then we might argue on how much. And the numbers that these guys are coming up with is pretty big.
Okay. The one thing I'd kind of like to ask is, so you kind of talked about it from the perspective of these are the costs of the policies. Does the article kind of state anything about the potential gains?
Economic gains, no, because
80% of back.
Somebody said something. No, go ahead. You had a.
Someone had a window going.
Yeah. I think that there will be, it will be plausible to make some arguments about economic gains associated with. Of those, I think the only one that I could make a claim would be maybe the ACA. Okay, so you could think that somehow a healthier population, if we're able to in 10 years by expanding healthcare, a healthier population might be more productive as a result, and the sort of like lower levels of distress and debts associated with people that go into medical, large medical bills and things like that. You could argue that that's a potential positive shock to the economy there. The other two, I think, are very difficult to come up with a story where increasing taxes leads to a growth progress, to lead to a growth sort of like circle. And the same thing with the energy thing. It's very hard to think about a way in which a carbon tax will be. It's not a carbon tax. That's not what the proposal is. But all the interferences in the carbon market, right? That's the various ways in which the proposals are coming from. Will be generating growth.
Well, to be fair, I could imagine ways in which, more ways in which people would say that the ACA expansion and the green energy stuff could aid growth long term. This is, in my own view, but you might think a lot of countries pay a lot less for healthcare than we do. ones that have more robust public healthcare options. Maybe we could therefore save money on healthcare by extending the ACA. That money then gets invested elsewhere,
Great.
and therefore can help grow the economy. I could imagine that that argument being made. And then Biden's argument on the green energy stuff is that it will create a lot of jobs, and that also there's going to be this move to green energy in the long run anyway. Someone's going to be the leader in that transition, and if we're the leader in it, it'll pay economic dividends, down the road. So those are I would think, the pro-growth, eventual pro-growth or pro-economic arguments for these kind of moves.
I mean, it's a substitution effect there, right? Because you have to acknowledge from the get-go that we're going to be moving away from the really nice paying jobs of West Texas, and from all the jobs in the Gulf of Mexico here of the production and export of oil and oil products and refineries. And I mean, it's an enormous industry so it's a question of elasticities, right? When you tax that industry, hoping to get them out of existence. I mean, he said so openly yesterday. A lot of people are going to have to transition out of that industry in order to move into this new industry that maybe it's possible for us to create, right? So, and let me just point out something about that that's really the most optimistic folks in research of energy will claim that if we're able to get to 60% of what we do right now in terms of emissions, it'll be a miracle. In terms of, if you can get our matrix of energy used to like something 60% of carbon, it's like carbon is going to be part of us no matter what. And the question is, how much we want to speed that transition or not potentially. But I think that's yeah. So that's something that is you don't want to kill necessarily the industry that is going to be part of the solution anyway, right? So you have to be a little careful with that.
And you could see Trump made a lot of hay over that in the debate. Biden sort of took the bait in saying that he wants to move away from gas, or rather from oil. And you got that Trump saying that was the biggest comment of the night. And are you listening, Texas? Are you listening, Ohio? Are you listening, Pennsylvania? I thought it was one of his most effective moments in the debate. I mean, the claim on the environmentalist side, or on Biden's side there, is right. This is a kind of investment that'll pay dividends long term. And I don't have a crystal ball to predict the future of energy and what technologies are going to develop. But I'm very, at an ideological level, skeptical of those decisions being centrally planned. I think it's morally wrong for economic decisions to be centrally planned in that way. And I don't think they're able to do it. I don't think you can really project. If you were able to project what the energy needs of 50 years from now or 100 years from now would be, what technologies there are, what would be the most profitable, you could make a lot of money starting a company and doing it. And I don't think politicians are able to engineer those futures effectively. So my sense of how environmental policy should go is to move away from these types of ideas of investment and shaping what our energy future is going to be, and move towards, if we can show that a certain technology on a certain time scale is really harmful, and harmful enough that it's worse than the consequences of abandoning it, then you could have laws banning it or regulating it, or saying you need to have this technology to clean it up. And we can debate about where the thresholds are on that. But the idea that we should have industrial planning, in effect, to get us to what we think fuel technologies need to be 20 years from now, 30 or 40 years from now, that is too much like, new economic policy and 5-year plans in the Soviet Union. I don't think it's the job of government to be doing that. I don't think it can do it well.
I mean, I agree. I would argue that if there is if we identify that moving away from carbon is something that is important, and we can debate again here to what extent we are generating externality, right? That's how we economists like to talk about that, and what's the value of that externality. We know how to manage this in a way that is not choosing the direction in which the market should go. That will be by the imposition of a carbon tax. So a carbon tax is the most efficient way to deal with this, and that will be without picking a winner or loser, all of us use carbon in some way, so all of us are going to have to pay a tax associated with this, right? And the amount of the tax, that's the part that becomes like the discussion, is the amount of the tax going to be something that will be a function of the cost that nobody's bearing right now, right? That's what's called the Pigouvian tax, of like, okay, what it is that I have to create to make sure that we internalize the cost of the creation of the externality that's out there. And again, by that number that I pointed out to you, the $10, the 10% decrease in GDP, that's one way to measure, right? If you look at, okay, if we don't do it, it's gonna cost us 10% of GDP in 100 years. You can discount that present value and think about what the price of carbon should be today. By that calculation, you're looking at something like $1 per ton, okay, of a carbon tax. The proposals in place are $40 per ton. So it's beyond the externality discussion. It's about doing away with a certain way to produce energy. And again, I think you have to go to the UN report and say, okay, what did they get it wrong there? Because my $1 per carbon calculation comes from the UN and the panel of scientists that came up with this sort of worst case scenario.
Whose proposal is this $40 per ton proposal? Is that part
That's Canada. Canada was, I think that's the number that they passed it on. I think that they started with 40, they went down to 20 after some debates and discussions. In Europe, some countries have it and is not far from somewhere between 20 and 40.
So that's where we're finding it in peer countries, basically.
Yes, and in fact, I remember there was a letter written by a very large number of people not long ago in the Wall Street Journal. A lot of academics, hundreds of them, saying that for climate change we need to go on a carbon tax. And in that letter, I think suggested something around the 20s. And in that letter, this proposal was actually a budget neutral proposal. It's like reduce the income tax across the board, reduce the amount, right? So to multiply whatever the number of carbon units we have per 20, okay, this is going to generate X billion dollars for the government. Take that out from the income tax. Just, instead of taxing people's income, which is inefficient and creates distortions, tax some carbon instead. That is something that will be a much easier bargain to digest if we were able to do it.
I mean, if we went to a carbon tax that was revenue neutral, it seems to me it would be basically equivalent to having a VAT, because there's carbon at every stage in the value add process, to having a VAT plus a tax differential non-carbon energy, right? So you have the equivalent of a VAT, and then people who could make their energy without carbon get out of it.
Right.
And it's one of the less scary economically ideas to incentivize moving away from carbon.
Right.
Any further thoughts? I mean, for those of you, for people which includes me, who are planning to vote for Biden, how do you guys think about this? Is it that you think these policies are right or worth it, or you're not sure about the math in this? And of course, there are good reasons to wonder about anybody. Biden says he's got a prediction where he's going to grow the economy more, and in every election, each candidate thinks they're going to, says they're going to be better for the economy. So is it that you believe that? Is it that you don't know what to believe? Is it that you think something outweighs this? Where do you guys stand?
So on the first note, I think I'm hesitant to completely trust the calculation of it, just because, even if it's similar to CBO methodology, I don't know. I think once the specific policy proposal gets in front of Congress, I think the CBO will have a better estimate of what the implications of all these policies are. I'd kind of like to address kind of each point that you said in terms of policy proposals from Biden. So the first thing you said was in relation to environmental policy. So I personally, as somebody who's just kind of looked at climate change and studied it, I don't think that addressing it from an economic angle is enough to address the scope of the problem. I think climate change is more than an economic issue; it's a humanitarian issue in a lot of ways. So when you look at it from that angle, one of the things I've looked at is the growth in natural disasters, and not just the humanitarian impact, but also the economic cost of those disasters. I think the United States has seen an enormous uptick in the past decade of $1 billion natural disasters. I think we're totaling almost 14, 15 per year. In past decades, it was around 6. So you have to wonder, how is climate change, contributing to that, and are the costs worth it in that sense, if they're creating that much economic damage and humanitarian destruction. In terms of what you said about the ACA, I'd like to kind of build on Greg's point. For a lot of Democrats like myself, I think they approach healthcare from a moralistic standpoint. I think the line that you'll hear pretty much every Democrat say is that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And so I think talking about it solely from an economic angle and, talking to the other side, talking between both sides sometimes can feel like apples and oranges. But regarding the economic issue, I'd kind of like to build on Greg's point, is that, I think it's the number is something like over 50% of American families aren't prepared for an unexpected expense of $400 or more. I think that a lot of those expenses tend to be healthcare expenses. And I think, providing insurance, whether it be through a public option, especially when you think about the poorest Americans, I think it's 19 states that didn't expand Medicaid. When you provide a public option to them, it gives them an extra level of economic security. They're not having to save, every dime to account for, an unexpected medical bill. And when they're not having to do that, that money, re-enters the economy in the form of disposable income. So I think while the ACA might have costs, I know that, when the ACA was first introduced, I think the CBO estimates showed how that affected growth and whatnot. But, I'd like to see what the gains are from. I think intuitively people can imagine that there would be an increase in disposable income from people having more coverage. And the last point you said was the tax rate. So you're saying, I think a 10% drop in GDP over 10 years. My counter argument to that is that the tax policy under Obama was at 35%, a corporate tax rate. Economic growth was pretty consistent around 2%. I think, 2.2, 1.6. I think it hit its peak in, I want to say 2015, probably at 2.9. And when Trump lowered those corporate tax rates from 35 to 21%, I think the initial expectation of this before was that, GDP growth was going to hit 4%. It never did. We're still at 2.9%. And I think Chris would be more qualified to speak on the tax implications. I think he's far more qualified than I am. But he talked about how tax rates don't really affect recovery. And more than that, I think the impact of tax rates doesn't just affect GDP growth, but it also affects, like we talked about, deficits and debts. I think fiscal responsibility is important, and the federal deficit obviously contributes to long-term interest rates, and that has an impact on median household income as well. So, I don't know the specific numbers. I think when you kind of look at the economic implications of it, you may know more than I do. But I do believe that just specifically looking at the economic implications is too narrow. I think you need to look at a broader view of this. So if anybody wants to build on that.
Yeah, I've got a couple of just quick thoughts. One is our UT's very own Julia Coronado, economics professor, actually was on CNBC today or yesterday talking about the Hoover Institution report, and I think brings up some of the points that we've been talking about expanded health care can have a positive externality, right? And so can make up for some of the GDP that may be lost through that. I don't disagree that Obamacare, to a large degree, has affected jobs, because when you say, if you work 30 hours or more per week, you have to offer health insurance, then all of a sudden, every Walmart employee in the United States is working 29.5 hours a week. It's amazing how that works. On kind of clean energy, I was just pulling up some of my notes. So I think a couple little tidbits is, I think that a 10% drop is probably a little pessimistic for a couple of reasons. One, and I just pulled this up from a friend of mine who is in this space. So in North Carolina, which is a big, it has a bunch of solar developments, new solar projects drive a nearly 2,000% average increase in annual tax revenue per parcel. And so I think that's obviously probably an outlier, but I think like the increased tax base could make up for some of the kind of shortfalls, perhaps, of clean energy. And then two more thoughts, and then we can move on to the next topic, because I feel like we've been on this for a minute. One is, Greg, your point about when to kind of cap different things and when the government should kind of get involved, I think is well taken. But the government already, to a large degree, subsidizes carbon, right? I think the most, in my mind, being a tax person, egregious example is depletion, right? So an oil royalty owner automatically gets to take 15% of their income and just count it as an expense. The idea is that they're depleting. It's kind of like depreciation and using up their resources, but it doesn't matter. It's just 15%. And so I did a little quick calculation. In 2019, we had the U.S. produced about 12 million barrels a day. And so that's about 4.5 billion barrels in 2019. If we are kind of conservative at $40 a barrel, we're talking $178 billion worth of oil. And so if we take the 15% off and then use, again, a conservative tax rate, we're talking like $5.3 billion subsidy to the oil industry. And so I think point well taken that the government shouldn't necessarily get involved in advocating one or the other, but they already kind of do that in the form of tax incentives and things like that. And I think there's something to be said for having the government encourage innovation, right? Without some of the government spending, like we wouldn't be having this call on the internet, right? The DARPA created the internet. That was a government-funded project. Velcro, which isn't as popular anymore. But I think there are instances where I think it makes sense for the government to, kind of put their thumb on the edge of innovation. Because at some point, fossil fuels are not renewable. We will run out of fossil fuels at some point in the future. I don't know when that is. And we'll have to figure out a different way to, power our iPhones.
So let me just respond to a couple of things here on this. I think all good points in a lot of ways. First is that on the ACA, let me be very clear that I am not necessarily arguing that expanding health coverage or even creating something like a England-based model would be a bad idea. The way we did via the ACA is incredibly bad for the job market. So the problem is the way in which we implement it. It might be the case that when we try to put a good idea through Congress, Congress does it whatever way they do it, and the good ideas turn into bad. I think Obama wanted a public option. Actually, it's something more like the English model, right? So I think that my concern with moving towards an English model is not a concern of that's basically a transfer, and I'm actually okay generally with transfers. I think we need to be prepared to accept a lower level of quality. We need to be prepared to accept a different level of service that we have now, and maybe that's a fair trade-off, and that I'm willing to take. I don't want that to be something that impacts the job market. That's one of the things that it's an implicit tax rate on the lowest of the skills in the population, that's where the problem really lies. That's one thing. On the energy side, I absolutely agree with you. We should do away with all subsidies to everybody. We shouldn't have no subsidies for anybody anywhere. I'm rare. I don't call myself a Republican, but that's subsidies are bad. Period. I don't want subsidies to the oil industry, nor I want subsidies for any other industry. And I think that in addition, the third thing is that even if you do want to spur innovation, the government has a role to play in basic research. So sure, making sure that we have grants for UT engineers to figure out batteries and things like that, that's very useful. That's very, very powerful. But thinking that through the market of, companies with good ideas and so on, just think about what we did. Elon Musk took advantage of a gigantic bonus from the government. And that's just not right. That's just not the right thing to make fancy cars. Again, I love those cars. I think he's amazing as an individual that did a lot of build a different company, but he didn't need the help from the government. He would have done it anyway. So I think that's problematic. Final thought on that is that we cannot have a conversation about energy without saying that the government has to get out of the way of regulating nuclear energy. We need nuclear energy. That is not an option. And right now, it is nearly impossible to expand that because of the government interventions. So it is safe. It is proven to be safe. Countries in the world are way ahead of us on this, and we need to basically stop with this notion that nuclear energy is scary.
All right, so a lot to say here. Let me put my 2 cents in on a few things. First, on the original issue of if you're planning on voting for Biden, how do you make sense of all of this stuff, which seems like an argument against him. So let me say where I am on that, and then on a lot of the topics that came up, healthcare or environmental disasters, government involvement in the economy. So I don't like Biden's economic policies. I don't think Trump's are that good either, and I don't think they're worlds apart. But I think on a number of issues, Biden's are worse. I don't know quite how much worse. I'm not even positive they are worse in everything because it's hard to judge and gauge these things, and I'm not an expert on it. But I suspect that growth would be some of the policies that we've talked about, I think, are counter to growth. And I think that's bad. I suspect that more moderated versions of them will get passed rather than the full policies. I think even if he wins the Senate, he's going to win the Senate with a number of people from reddish states who are going to be very slow to do major moves that would impact, for example, the fossil fuel industry. So I think we're going to get a moderated, watered down version of these proposals. They're already moderated, watered down versions of further left on economics proposals that we've heard from other candidates. And then I think he'll be in office for only 4 to 8 years, and there'll be a chance to reverse them, maybe a chance to reverse them 4 years from now. Moreover, I think for the Republicans to get what I would see as a real pro-growth policy, they need to change their standpoint on a lot of issues. And they're now changing in the wrong direction. So they're getting much more interventionist on trade, and they're not solving any of the problems in medicine and in the other fields. So I think what we really need is, if we're going to go in a direction that would lead to higher economic growth, we're going to need a Republican Party that actually has plans and ideas. And I think under Trump, we're not going to get that. We're going to get a kind of static, slow, it'll do a little bit of deregulation, but without laws that actually deregulate, and they'll all get changed back the next time we have a Democrat. Whereas I think what we really need in medicine is an alternative to Obamacare, which, you know, Trump keeps saying he's going to roll out next week, like he's going to show you his tax returns next week, but of course he never does it. And he didn't do it when he had a full, you know, all 3 parts of both houses of Congress. So I think the damage will probably be muted by political considerations, and there'll be a chance to undo some of it, I hope, and hopefully a reinvigorated Republican Party that has some fresh thinking in it over where it is now in the midterm elections and the next election. At least that's what I'm hoping for. On the particular issues, I agree healthcare is a moral issue, and that's why I oppose socialized healthcare, including the socialized healthcare that we've had since the mid-60s, because we don't live in a free healthcare economy. We live in a mostly socialist healthcare economy and have since Medicare. Healthcare is a right. It's a right in the same way that food's a right and every other good is a right. It's a good and service that people have to create in order to live and thrive. And like every other good and service, we need to be free to create it. And I'm not okay with us having an England or Europe style model of healthcare. But I'm also not okay with the model we have now. I think the kind of healthcare we have in all of these countries is immoral. It's wrong that healthcare should be treated as a governmental service to be doled out to people like a pittance when they get sick, that prevents people from planning for their own healthcare needs, for making decisions about what things they prioritize over which others, that for making decisions over, for example, how much they want to spend on end-of-life care, so that you have a situation where some countries don't spend much on end-of-life care and cut you off early, and others, like we do, spend a ton, and everybody has to be forced in one way or another to pay for other people's end-of-life care decisions. It should be left up to people to decide how much they want to allocate, how much they want to save, what kinds of insurance policies they want to get. Like everywhere else in life, it should be free in the sense of liberated, free from fetters, for people to make and plan their own healthcare decisions. And that's not anything we have anywhere in the world today. And I think it's morally wrong. It's a gross violation of all our rights. However, I don't see either party as moving us towards that in the near term, towards freedom. And we're just talking about one or another slight variation on the variety of unfreedom that we have in healthcare. And so I can't get too excited about the Democrats versus the Republicans versions of this. I think both of them are bad in one way or another, and we're going to have to fight over how to get it a little less bad, whichever one wins. On the environment, there's the issue of are there more disasters that are costing more money? Samuel, you put it as we have to think of this in humanitarian terms, not just economic terms, but then the evidence for the humanitarian terms that you were giving were there were more billion-dollar disasters. And I think part of that is the kind of evidence that one could give for trends is going to be some kind of quantitative evidence. And it's going to be, summed up economically often. So I think the kind of distinction between economic and humanistic ways of thinking about things, I don't really, if we're going to try to estimate it quantitatively, we're doing something that's going to look an awful lot like economics. And then the question is, what's the right way to do those estimates? I don't know what the right way is. I mean, I've not really looked into this data. I mean, there's inflation, so you'd expect the amount of disasters that cost more than a certain amount of money to go up over time, even if nothing else was changing. Also, there's growth, economic growth in like property values are higher. So if a beachfront property in Miami costs twice as much as it did 10 years ago, and 10 of them get destroyed in a hurricane both times, it'll be more. That there definitely are some very high profile disasters that have high costs in life, and how to weight those, one, how much worse they're getting, and if they're getting worse, and how to weight those is a difficult problem. I don't know the data behind it. So that's where I am on that. And regarding government involvement in the economy, I agree with Carlos that I don't think there should be subsidies for anyone in the oil industry, but I put it, and there are certainly now subsidies all throughout the energy industry and every industry. But I put a distinction between government putting its finger on the scale here or there and trying to affect this and incentivize that, all of which I think it shouldn't be doing, and government having a long-range plan for the economy where it's counting on certain outcomes that it thinks it can predict. So in other words, if we change this incentive structure, here's where things will be in 10 years, and then that'll happen in 5 years. It's those kind of plans that I don't think, first of all, I think are wrong. I think they were attempts to manipulate all of us. And two, I don't think we can make them properly. So if you just have a view like innovation is good, we'll give grants to innovators or something like that, I still don't think we should be doing that. But it's not the same level of bad, in my view, as a kind of detailed plan for how the economy will progress over the next 10 years, that we're counting on it being right to justify specific expenditures now. We're going to do something that we think will cut growth in the next 10 years because we are sure we've played out how it's going to increase growth 30 years from now. I don't think we can make those calculations. I don't think it's possible. And I think this, and as for subsidies, here's where I'm more radical than Carlos, I guess. I don't think we should have subsidies for innovation. I don't think we should have government funding of research, except where it has direct military implications. I think those things should be handled privately. Now, they are all handled publicly now, and you can't just say pull the plug on everything overnight. There'd have to be a process of privatizing various institutions and what the steps would look like to get there. But I think the basic principle why we shouldn't be subsidizing any given industry applies to subsidizing research also. And then the last question on this is, what subsidies are there for oil? Because I would be surprised to find that there aren't any. I think there were subsidies all over the place and complicated, lobbying on all these things. But the example you gave was of depreciation on oil, on property, on oil wells, if I'm understanding properly, being an example of a subsidy to the oil industry. And I don't know what the state of the laws there are, but it's not obvious to me that that's a subsidy. I mean, other kinds of resources you have that deplete in value, you're allowed to depreciate over time on your taxes. It seems to me that that's appropriate. And if you have a property that it's believed so many gallons of oil can come out of, and half of those gallons have already come out, the property's value is depleted. And it seems to me not implausible to get for it to be treated that way on its taxes. I don't know how depreciation on oil works, on oil fields or property works in taxes, but it seems to me to say it's a subsidy, we would have to be saying that it gets a kind of treatment in the tax code relative to its change in economic value that's different than other property gets relative to its changing economic value over time. And if that's true, that it's a subsidy, I don't think we should have it, but I don't know if it's true.
Sure. So one, I think just a question to help me clarify my understanding of kind of where you're at, Greg, is when you say like you're not necessarily for kind of these very long range projections, which I agree. The only thing we know with any certainty is that they're always wrong, right? Because there's just too many variables, right? But would that not then lead us to just always focus on the short term? Because there are certain things that I think in the long run are very negative that maybe aren't that bad in the short term. And if we wait too long, then there's a point of no return. And climate change would be, I think, a good example of that. Like if we wait too long, we will reach a point of no return, and then we'll all have to go live with Matt Damon on Mars. And so I think just kind of clarifying, I don't think that's what you're saying, but that's kind of how I heard that.
Yeah, I think if you know that there's a long-range disaster that can be averted by doing something, then I think it's okay. It's right to do it. But what the long range that I'm concerned, it's not a long range or short range, it's detailed planning of the economy, or general planning of the economy that I think is wrong. And I don't think can be affected. So if we found that we need to get off carbon tomorrow for such and such to prevent a cataclysm, right? So let's get rid of the 10% gross changes. If we found that unless we totally stop carbon emissions by 2020, everyone will drop dead in 2025. So it's not an issue of GDP will go down by 10% or whatever. If we knew that, then there should be a law that says nobody's allowed to emit any carbon or whatever by burning any fossil fuels starting in 2025, and people are going to have to figure out how to deal with that. But what we shouldn't do is have the government plan, well, just what industries will do what in the meantime to get there. That's what I think they can't do. Now, I don't think the evidence is such that unless we get to zero carbon by 2030 or 2025, everyone will drop dead. It's a much more subtle, there's going to be various warming this amount, that we're this certain there will be various calamities which are going to have you can quantify what their downside will be, and there's a lot of disagreement about just how to quantify it, but it's not like everyone drops dead. And then I think it's much harder to figure out what the policy should be, but the policy should be something about banning or limiting things that we know are going to cause harm because we know they're going to cause harm, and not trying to work out what there should be in its place and plan how to get there in its place. And I'm fairly agnostic on what the details of what things should be allowed and banned are, or what things should be. I'm even uncomfortable with disincentivizing through tax code, but given that we have that so much already, I'm not horrified at the prospect of some tax incentives here. But I think we want to, in general, be moving away from manipulation via the tax code and moving towards creating a situation where people are bearing the costs of their own actions, and that things that are harming other people are either made illegal or the harms are redirected back upon the people doing them. And then with how this all applies to climate change and fossil fuels, I think we all have to take whatever it is in the context of the fact that energy is an unalloyed good, and cheaper energy is an unalloyed good. If you can bring the price of energy down by a cent per kilowatt hour or something, there are lives that are being saved by that. And every cent higher by kilowatt hour it goes, there are lives that are being cost by that. And any calculation we make whereby we say climate change is going to kill this many people or harm or impoverish this many people, therefore we have to this extent, therefore we have to do something to fight it or disincentivize the use of the technologies that cause it, has to be taken in the context of knowing that anything we do to reduce those technologies is going to drive up the price of energy and is literally going to kill people. So we have to think of it like someone's not going to be able to afford a respirator, or some vaccine is not going to be able to be kept cold long enough. And so we have to think about the price in human lives on both sides. And the fact that we are able to, find technological solutions to environmental problems that come up. So all of that needs to be factored in before we make the determination that we've got to get off CO2 by this or that time.
I guess in addition to that, I think one of the major problems that I have with us trying to do too much, and is that if you think about the major segments of the world through the world economy, the US, Europe, China, India, we're the only ones that have reductions in emissions. The only ones in the last 20 years. All the other blocks are just going up and up and up. So, yeah, let's take and make energy more expensive for us, and maybe that's not going to have an impact at all. In particular, relative to the amount that we are aiming. The reality is that, as Greg pointed out, that the growth that's going to come out of Africa, for example, predicted at least, is going to be coming from fossil fuels. And is it moral for us to go to them and say, hey, no, you stay poor, and because we have made it our way out into riches, but you cannot. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. We need to mitigate climate change. We cannot change. We cannot just, I don't think we're going to be able to. We'll pass laws, we'll create carbon taxes here and there, and you know what? Alone, we're not going to solve it, and emissions are going to go up, and until we start seeing something significantly more, if it ever happens, right? Significantly different in terms of cost on that, we're not gonna. I don't think there's a solution to it. That's my point.
So there's a way to think about leaving Africa poor or preventing them from doing something they need to do to become rich, where it seems self-serving. We're rich now and we're going to stop you, Africa, or try to discourage you, Africa, from doing what you could do to get to where we are. But it's tremendously self-destructive to do that. Think about how much better off we all are because of the tremendous advances in India and China over the last 30 years. All of these people have risen out of poverty. There are lots of problems with China in particular politically, but all of the things that are produced there that we can get more cheaply, how much better off all our lives are because of that, and how much knowledge is being discovered in these places as people get more educated, have more free time and disposable income, as more people can go into research and so forth.
Not only there, but the ones that come here as well, right? Our universities are populated by fantastic Chinese and Indian students and researchers and so on. So,
and that knowledge, the growth in knowledge is what will enable us to solve the various problems and catastrophes that we have in the future, whether environmental or of other sorts. The growth in knowledge and the growth in resources. And imagine if everyone in Africa was doing as well as the best people in China are doing, or the best people, best in terms of best position, best economically, best educated, and so forth. Imagine if the worst off people in Africa were as well as the best off people in India, or the best off people in Britain, or the best off people in America. It's not just good for those people. It's good. Think of what they'll discover, what resources they'll have that they'll be able to contribute to solving problems. I don't think we can afford to leave those people poor. That is, just step on the things that would allow them to get rich. So, there are questions about what are the threats from climate change, what policy changes could avert the worst of those threats, how much they could do to avert them, and what other costs those would have. And I don't know the answers to all of those questions, but I know that if we're thinking about them in a way where we're not taking into account the horrors that would come from slowing growth, including on our ability to deal with whatever threats are going to come down the line, that we're not really doing the thinking about it. And I'm worried that the kind of consensus views in how to think about climate amount to worrying a lot about the catastrophe, but not worrying too much about the catastrophes from possible climate change, but not worrying too much about the effects of mitigation efforts on it. Sorry, the effects of anti-fossil fuel measures. Or on the other hand, just not thinking about it. And which is what I think too often the Republicans are doing. And I think it's the same kind of false alternative I think we had with COVID. We either have lockdowns or we pretend the thing's going to go away and it's not a big problem, as opposed to like really thinking about what's needed to get out of this and what's really going on here. And it's worrying that I don't think we're getting the right kind of thought about it.
Now, so one thing that I want us to do is to, by the end of I know the election after this, we can look at CBO's predictions for the next 4 years. And then I want to revisit us, look at what they, because they project now for the next 4 years. And then we can look after new laws come into place what their projected result, and then we can look at the actuals. So I really want to have the discussion 4 years from now in the next election. And we can talk about all of this, climate, health, taxes, and my guess is that we're not going to be in that different of a place, but that's my hope at least.
Yeah, I suspect we won't be in that different a place on those measures, regardless of who wins this election, but we will see. We're reaching the end of the time we set aside for tonight. So let's draw a line here. We didn't talk about the debate except incidentally, but I don't think there was that much new information in it, so that's okay. And we'll resume at the same time, 4:30 next week for our last episode prior to the election itself. And I think we'll have some looking back at it episodes afterwards. So thanks everyone for coming. I hope you guys in YouTube land got something out of this conversation. I've certainly found it edifying and interesting.